Good morning, well, afternoon now. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage website for your future reference, and our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's discussion is Ted Broman. Ted is our Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He studies and writes on British foreign and security policies as well as, of course, Anglo-American relations. He joined us after a decade at Yale University's Associate Director of International Security Studies. He was also a lecturer in history and international affairs. He has contributed essays and analyses to the American Opinion Monthly Commentary and to Great Britain's Yorkshire Post, as well as a variety of scholarly journals. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in history at Grinnell and his Master of Arts, Master of Philosophy, and Doctorate, all in history, from Yale. Please join me in welcoming Ted Broman. Ted?
Thanks very much, John, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us here today in what I'm sure will be an interesting discussion, even if the weather outside is not particularly pleasant. This is the third panel in this series of discussions. In our first panel in August, hosted by Dr. Kim Holmes, we heard from Professor Colin Dueck of George Mason University and Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. In our second event in September, Ambassador Rich Williamson, Professor William Inboden of the LBJ School in Texas, and myself offered our own views on the question we'll be considering today. Today we have the third in this ongoing series of panels. All the panels so far have considered the question of whether fundamental ideological changes are at hand, are possible, or are desirable in U.S. foreign policy. And as previous panelists have pointed out, there are new and somewhat unusual alignments at hand between what now I think must be considered 6 separate schools of U.S. foreign policy, even if there is some overlap between them. Internationalist institutional liberals, progressives, libertarians, Reaganite conservatives, realists, and neoconservatives. This is not an entirely new debate for conservatives or for those on the rightward side of the spectrum. Indeed, I'd argue that a lot of the vitality of the U.S. conservative movement owes something to its fractiousness and its willing to get into arguments with itself. In my view, it's a progressive illusion to believe that foreign policy, progress in foreign policy or anything else depends on top-down direction. So I think the kind of debates, the very lively debates we've seen over the last month and years, and we'll see here today, are part of the price we pay, if I can put it this way, for a more open, a more free-thinking, and a more popular political system than exists in many other parts of the world. I do think that debates now are sharper, perhaps, than they have been in the past, in part because there is a progressive in the White House. If there was an even nominal conservative in the White House, there'd be a natural tendency, I think, to coalesce behind that individual and their policies. But even that is only very partly true. We might remember that the Heritage Foundation itself was founded in 1973, in part in opposition to détente, a policy advanced by a Republican president. Always worthwhile bearing that in mind. So it's my pleasure to host this event today, in which 3 distinguished speakers will consider the present and future direction of U.S. foreign policy and the ideas behind any new directions in U.S. foreign policy. Our speakers will remain seated throughout the event. They will not speak in quite the order that we have them here on the panel today. Leading off will be Dr. Kim Holmes. Dr. Holmes is Distinguished Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He was, for most of the period from 1991 through 2012, Heritage's Vice President for Foreign Policy and Defense Studies and Director of the Davis Institute for International Studies, except during President George W. Bush's first term, when he was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. He is currently writing, or I should say more accurately, has finished the writing of a book, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great. I've been told I can only mention this book once during this panel, so this is my mention of it. I encourage all of you to take a look and purchase early on Amazon. Speaking second, Marianne Smith, visiting fellow in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics here at the Heritage Foundation. As a visiting fellow, Marianne explores the history of U.S. foreign policy and the continuing relevance of our political traditions in understanding America's role in the world today. He is the author, most recently, of a fine heritage special report, The Myth of American Isolationism, Commerce, Diplomacy, and Military Affairs in the Early Republic. Speaking third and winding up our panel, Professor Randy Barnett. Professor Barnett is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal Theory at Georgetown University's Law Center. After graduating from Northwestern University and Harvard Law School, he tried many felony cases as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Chicago. In 2004, he argued the medical marijuana case of Gonzalez v. Reich before the U.S. Supreme Court. His publications include more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as 9 books, including Restoring the Lost Constitution, The Presumption of Liberty, from Princeton in 2005, and from Oxford in 2010, The Oxford Introduction to U.S. Law, Contracts. I'll ask Dr. Holmes to kick off, Marion to go second, Professor Barnett to go third, and then we'll have time afterwards for question and answer. Dr. Holmes.
Thank you, Ted. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here this afternoon. As Ted mentioned, one of the premises of these series of discussions is basically posing the question of whether or not our ideology and the politics of American foreign policy are in flux. I believe they are. Where it's going, I'm not really sure, but I think we all know the reasons why this question is being raised. Libertarians and libertarian-minded conservatives are, in some cases, joining liberals in critique of NSA surveillance, military budgets, and the like. Some are worried that libertarian-minded conservatives are becoming isolationists. This is a question that's raised quite often. Some people who are sometimes called neoconservatives some are saying that they're drifting closer to what used to be understood as the humanitarian interventionist wing of the Democratic Party, supporting, for example, limited military strikes in the name of humanitarian causes. So there's a lot going on, and we're just trying to make some sense of this. I think there is, my own personal view is that there is a conversion of libertarian and traditional conservative views on foreign policy. I think the answer is that that's partly true. But there are still deep philosophical differences which will limit this convergence, and I think we best have a candid discussion about what they are. I personally believe it's more fruitful to talk about a convergence of classical liberalism and traditional American conservatism rather than between libertarianism and conservatism per se. And the reason I say that is because the fusion between classical liberalism and conservatism has already been done. As a matter of fact, it's been done well over a half of a century. The fusionist movement in conservatism began in the 1950s, and it was based upon 3 ideas. One was a belief in small government and the free market, which was an inheritance of both the classical liberal and the U.S. constitutional traditions. Number 2, traditional values, respect for religion and morality, for example, which manifested itself in what we commonly call social conservatism. And third was standing up for liberty, not only at home but abroad, which at first was wrapped up in the 50s and the 60s in the cause of anti-communism, but lingered on after that, after the end of the Cold War, and took on other causes, for example, dealing with radical Islamism. Now, I don't think I would be offending libertarians by saying that they enthusiastically embraced the first of these ideas, in other words, small government and free markets, but they were decidedly less enthusiastic about the other 2, social conservatism and the foreign policy posture. But I do believe that the question is still whether or not the new international situation and also the political flux that I talk about warrants a new look at the situation. It's maybe possible that conservatives could learn something from libertarians about foreign policy, but also maybe libertarians could learn something from conservatives. The Cold War is long over. The wars of the last decade are over and winding down. Perhaps a more open discussion is possible. Perhaps not over philosophy or doctrine, or even, for that matter, history, because that's where compromise is probably least likely to happen, but over the actual practices of American foreign policy. In that regard, I have a couple of observations and suggestions. The first is this, that classic liberals, and perhaps even some libertarians, have a point. that seeing America's mission in the world as being mainly about military power, or more specifically about using that power directly and specifically to spread values like democracy and freedom, is bound to lead to excesses, mistakes, and even failures. If the strategy of power becomes an end in itself, even if it's done in the name of ideals, that will not only it will lead in some cases to failures in foreign policy, but it also can lead possibly to the loss of our ideals, and particularly our belief in freedom and the process. Conversely, basically saying the same thing in another way, they also have, libertarians also have a point that making the exercise of American power all about values, whether promoting democracy or freedom, is also bound to lead to mistakes and even to failures. Once the exercise of power becomes a purely ideological exercise, all practical limits are thrown out the door. The natural conservative value of prudence can be lost, and the end justifies the means in the most extreme version, and we all know how badly that can end in certain circumstances. Now, however, that does not mean, in my opinion, that American military power, so long as it is directed to the right aims, is somehow morally flawed or a misdirection of the American cause. Some on the left, and indeed some on the libertarian right, make this argument. Now, leftists extend their war on American values, its free market economy, and its constitutional system of government to the American cause itself, to the idea of the American nation, and even in some cases, even to its people and the government that its people elect. Whereas libertarians extend their distrust of government at home to what the United States government does overseas. I think both of these views misunderstand the unique and indeed I would say exceptional role that America has played in history and the world. As I explain in the book that Ted mentioned, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great, America has always had a mission of standing up for the spread of liberty. In the early days, when we were weak, America was mainly seen as a model for others to follow. When we became stronger, it took on a more missionary role. It's important to remember that the Truman Doctrine actually said that a threat to anyone else's liberty in the world from communism was a threat to us all, including Americans. Now, it may be true that in this day and age, we no longer believe that as a matter of national strategy. Nevertheless, I do believe it is part of the American experience to believe that liberty is indivisible. And that belief in that is what makes us exceptional and different from other countries. But how we manifest that ideal in actual policy changes over time. And therefore, it's a question really of practicality rather than principle, how you apply that. Now, that's why I think that we have to be very careful about throwing words around like American imperialism. We actually had a time in our history, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where the United States did have colonies. When under Teddy Roosevelt, we did have imperialist ambitions. But eventually we moved beyond that period and we began to champion other people's freedom as our own. We occupied Germany to free it from Nazism, just as we occupied Iraq to free it of Saddam Hussein. Now, you can argue that that was a mistake, at least in the latter case, and things did not turn out the way we wanted. But it is not convincing to me to assert that American idealistic impulses are of the same species as European imperialism, with its lust for colonies, its subjugation of peoples, its exploitation of peoples and resources, and even its anti-democratic practices. I don't see them as the same thing. My main argument that I'd like to leave with you here today is that there is nothing inherently contradictory with limited government at home and a strong military abroad. Indeed, in today's circumstances, I believe they are inextricably linked. Ronald Reagan certainly did not think there was a contradiction. Some may believe that Reagan and conservatives got it all wrong, but in Reagan's mind, and certainly in the view of this institution for the last 25 years, defending American security in the world was striking a blow for American liberty. In other words, we could not have secured our own liberty without working with other like-minded countries to help them secure their liberty as well. I think in this respect, it's really important not to confuse principles and tactics, or even specific national security strategy to protect our liberty with the principles of liberty itself. America became a superpower after World War II and during the Cold War because conservatives and liberals alike thought doing so was necessary to protect the country under the circumstances that existed at that time. They thought it was necessary to defend our freedom. They thought it was necessary to defend our way of life. And they thought it was necessary, by the way, to protect the constitutional form of government which gave us our freedom. Containment and other strategy were mere mechanisms or means to achieve those ends. It was called for by the times, and it was, in a sense, our mission of liberty, interacting with the real conditions of the world at that time. Now, I'm fully aware that the original doctrine of containment against the Soviet Union and communism, the spread of communism, was, wait for this, a liberal project. After all, it was invented by a liberal named Harry Truman, and it was revived by another former Democrat named Ronald Reagan. And I'm also aware that this fact unnerves a lot of people, both my liberal friends and also my conservative friends, when I remind them of this. But we really can't get anywhere by trying to settle all historical scores. What's done is done. We must try to learn from one another and learn what's best on the way forward. So here's what I propose to do this. The first thing to do is to try to get a firm grip on the circumstances in which we live. Just as we adapted the traditional American cause of liberty during World War II, during the Cold War, we must do so again today. What are those circumstances? The way I see it is that we live in a world in which Western countries, including the United States, have economies that are floundering. It's a world that is highly diffuse, and thus problems are not easily given to fixing with the direct application of military power. It's a world in which other powers like China are rising. And it's also a world which is still exceedingly dangerous and morphing new kinds of threats which we may not even be aware until they're upon us. So with this in mind, I would propose in terms of a strategy, the following: that we more narrowly define the purposes of American power, particularly military power. Purposes would be not to engineer the domestic arrangements of foreign states, whether for humanitarian or even freedom agenda purposes, but rather to maintain a global balance of power in our favor. And it may be that this favorable balance of power would actually benefit freedom, not just our own, but other people's. And it may even benefit humanitarian purposes around the world. But these, I have to say as an analyst, I would say if I was a politician, I would probably get in trouble for saying this, but as an analyst, I could say these good things would be derivative. They would not be the driving purposes. There could be, under this way of looking at the world, fewer military interventions, but it's not because we can't afford them. It's not because that we just somehow don't want to do them, but because we don't deem them necessary under the circumstances in which we live. Now, I very quickly want to add that power can be defined in all sorts of ways. Military power is only one part of the picture. Also involved, obviously, our economy, culture even, and certainly technology. And we must compete on all of these fronts to understand how all these pieces fit together. This is not something we are used to doing very well. Now, before any of us conclude that therefore this means that we can have smaller armed forces and military power doesn't matter anymore, I would not draw that conclusion. I just have a word of caution on that. Military power is still the bedrock of all power. Without it, nothing much else matters. If you don't have that, you can have all the culture in the world and no people will pay any attention to it. If you don't have an economy that's not producing wealth, then you're not going to have the military power to begin with. But they all do relate, but this does not mean that we can dispense with military power. In fact, I believe that in some cases we may have to refashion it, but it would be smaller in some areas and bigger in others. I can envision an American strategy that requires this balance of power that I mentioned, but it does not mean that the world would be the policeman of the world, or even necessarily to solve all the world's problems, but rather to manage them, which is, again, something that is not very well accepted in our political system. We believe, particularly since the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union disappeared, that we had the requirement to solve all the world's problems because we could. And it often got reduced to the application of military power. And then the expectations are so high with what we are supposed to be doing in the world, and when we don't succeed at it, our whole leadership is put into question, and I think that there's something wrong with that scenario. I will end here. I have some specifics, but I don't want to go on too long with what all this means. But I would just end by saying this, that what I'm really talking about here is strategic focus. And it's very important that I don't be misunderstood. Strategic focus doesn't mean retrenchment, and it doesn't mean retreat. It simply means that we have to set our priorities. In some cases, we may actually have to do more than we're doing. In some areas, we may have to do less. But it does mean a more disciplined approach. And it does mean also that what we really must do, we must do better than everybody else. But it also can mean that maybe we can stop wasting our time on some things which ultimately have little effect on American national security and American interests, and also the cause of American freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. I'd like to pass it over now to Marion Smith.
Right. Well, I'm the youngest and least distinguished person on this panel, so I'm going to take advantage of my youth and inexperience and talk about where I think my generation is on some of these questions. Oddly enough, at the same time where a lot of people my age, and there are a lot of you at my age in the room, so hopefully we'll have a good conversation in a little bit.
How old is that, by the way?
I'm not going to tell. But oddly enough, a lot of us are very dissatisfied with what we view as overly ideological foreign policies. And yet, we're falling for a lot of isms in foreign policy, and I think this is a bit of a paradox. Dr. Holmes did a really good job, obviously, of laying out some of the tactics and strategy that folks in my generation who pay attention to foreign policy don't pay a lot of attention to. Things like geography and culture and the importance, the necessity of collecting good intelligence on the ground. Nevertheless, I would like to talk mostly about ideas in foreign policy and basic precepts that I think a lot of us disagree over. This isn't the first time that we've been here. Previous times in our history, conservative libertarians and conservatives and liberals have disagreed over pretty basic elements of U.S. foreign policy, and yet I think we're sort of reaching a high point of disagreement over really fundamental questions. I'd like to quote from Frank Meyer, who wrote an article in 1968 called The Twisted Tree of Liberty, and he was addressing what he viewed as a very similar divergence over basic precepts of foreign policy that he thought all Americans of all stripes should pretty much agree on. And he was criticizing what he called pure libertarians. And he said, and I quote, "These pure libertarian pacifists applaud Ho Chi Minh, support the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, join the Sane Nuclear Policy Committee, and toy with the tactic of a united front with communists against war." So among the other things that he was criticizing there was a growing number of quote-unquote libertarians embracing a position that war itself was somehow a crime and that peace at any cost was somehow an appropriate policy aim. I think that today a lot of people want to describe this as isolationism. I think there have always been isolationist voices in U.S. foreign policy, but they have usually not determined U.S. foreign policy. Contrary to what most people think, the early days of our republic were not isolationist at all, and I think many of you received a special report where we try to lay out the actual foreign policies of the first 70 years. And you see a terribly robust and engaged level of trade with the rest of the world, and a navy and military to protect and defend that trade around the world. So that time in our history was not isolationist in any way. Oddly enough, the one period in our history where we saw isolationist voices have the most influential role in terms of shaping our policy was in the 1930s, the interwar period. And I would argue that we are perhaps at a similar point where we could have sort of the array of forces calling for an overall retrenchment come to shape our foreign policy. Certainly much more than in 1968 when Frank Meyer was writing this. And I think this is for four reasons. First of all, there's no clearly identified enemy like in 1968, the Soviet Union. Second of all, there is a war weariness that is keenly felt among the American people. This is because of Afghanistan, Iraq, and also Libya, and the disappointing results of our very limited engagement in Libya. Third, there are obvious fiscal limitations, which I would argue we've always had, but the popular opinion in this country has never felt, and lawmakers have perhaps never realized as well as they are these days. And fourth, there is a very obvious lack of leadership nationally. We used to call that statesmanship. So when a case is made for engagement abroad, it's very important how the President, the Commander-in-Chief, argues this to the American people. So, for example, when Obama was in Sweden, President Obama was explaining his red line, or backing away from his red line, and he said, and I quote, my reputation is not on the line. The international community's reputation is on the line. American people or Congress's reputation on the line, but my reputation is not on the line. Well, essentially, the Commander-in-Chief is AWOL. So, I mean, how can we blame the American people for not wanting to sort of blunder into another misadventure, despite the merit of intervening, when we have such a lack of leadership in the White House? So, in the midst of strategic ambiguity and a Commander-in-Chief that is unable to persuade the American people of why we should remain engaged, I think it's perfectly understandable that we'd rather sit out the next few rounds of international engagement. I don't think we can blame the American people for wanting to do this, even if it will have bad consequences. But the real problem is, of course, that wherever the United States gives up its influence and creates a power vacuum, that space is very likely to be filled by actors with very different ideas of international order that are hostile to American liberties. So this situation and the lack of a principled strategic policy over the last decade are squandering America's hard-won position of international influence. And of course, this is a shame. There are some really useful conversations and debates that we can have about our actions abroad in the 21st century going forward, but they really do require some common understanding on really basic questions about America's role in the world. Honestly, when you read it, the early disagreements between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists over foreign policy kind of pale in comparison to the wide disparity that exists among various camps on U.S. foreign policy today. And this is pretty troubling, honestly. So I'm going to try to be practical here for a minute and make one proposal and then offer sort of three basic ideas that I think we could all kind of get behind and then talk about tactics or strategy. The first is that there's this guy named Randolph Bourne, and he's seen a sort of resurrection of late. Who was Randolph Bourne? So Randolph Bourne was a early 20th century progressive thinker who wrote quite a bit on American citizenship and American foreign policy. He is one of the first to come up with the idea of a transnational America. He was an early critic of the nation state, and he wrote an essay shortly before he died that was published posthumously, in which he said that war is the health of the state. And for whatever reason, he is being appealed to as a sort of guide on basic questions of U.S. foreign policy these days. It's truly remarkable, the resurgence that he's had just in the last 6 months. The Atlantic has republished an excerpt from his essay. The American Conservative magazine has republished an excerpt. There are several other examples where he is viewed as someone that we should look to about how to think about U.S. foreign policy going forward. If we continue to look to people like that, I think we're going to see a greater divergence among sort of libertarian conservatives and maybe traditional conservatives and perhaps even liberals in this country about what we should be doing, what's our national interest, and how should we go about securing and advancing it. I would argue that why don't we look back at early U.S. statecraft? This is a time when we were close to the sources of our political principles. We had recently established the country. We were weak militarily, and yet we accomplish an awful lot in terms of advancing our principles in a prudent and strategic way. And I would say that a close look at early U.S. statecraft would sort of allow us to think afresh about some basic principles, and I'll just go over them very quickly. So just three basic ideas, which at first blush might seem so obvious as to be insulting to bring them up in a panel like this. And yet, many of you will know that these ideas are very much contested. So the first would be that the United States is not legally or morally responsible for the well-being of foreign peoples. We do not have a duty. They are not part of the polity of the United States of America. And so in our constitutional structure, we do not have a duty or responsibility for their future well-being. Now, earlier in our history, when opportunities arose overseas where we could play a role to advance liberty, it was deemed something we might want to do. And for example, with the Hungarian Revolution in 1848, we were contemplating intervening, and Abraham Lincoln, who was not yet on the national scene at the time, was paying attention, and he said that it would be meritorious for us to become involved, but that it wasn't our duty to do so. Now, having said that, I want to be very clear that even America's founders understood that we would be a model and that we should do a lot to help other people want to adopt our political principles. George Washington, when he was leaving his second term in office, said that he hoped that America's stronger position militarily and in terms of respectability would recommend America's principles to the applause, the affection, and adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. So we don't have a duty, and yet that doesn't mean we should have an amoral foreign policy and be disinterested in what's happening around the world. Number two, which I hope we can all agree on, is that foreign military intervention is constitutional and sometimes advisable. And I won't belabor the point on this. I will simply, I'll simply read the words of James Madison, father of the Constitution, who in contemplating whether or not we could intervene in the Tripolitan War to effectively depose the leader and install someone who was more in line with our interest, James Madison wrote, and I quote, "Although it does not accord with the general sentiments or views of the United States to intermeddle in the domestic contest of other countries, it cannot be unfair in the prosecution of a just war or the accomplishment of a reasonable peace to turn to their advantage the enmity and pretensions of others against a common foe." The third idea, which again I hope we can all agree on, is that war is not a crime. And there is, I think, within our culture and thinking on matters of international relations and international law, as sort of an acceptance that war is a crime, and that regardless of the motives for it, you are somehow engaged in criminal or suspect activity. These ideas had gained a lot of credence just after World War II and the establishment of the United Nations and several international treaties and proclamations which had outlawed war. The effect of this sentiment was so strong that we renamed our Department of War Department of Defense. And I don't think that it's any accident that of the couple dozen wars we have fought in our 220-something year history, all the ones that we have arguably lost have been fought after we changed the name of our department, which conducted wars. I'm not saying that that is causal, but I think it is part and parcel of the idea that war can't have good outcomes, when of course it can. The very existence of this country and securing our independence came about by war. And again, it seems sort of so obvious that it's almost insulting to say it, and yet an awful lot of our disagreements hinge on disagreements over these really fundamental questions. So I think perhaps I'll end it there and we can pick it up in the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marion. Professor Barnett, would you like to make your own points and respond to anything that you think is worthy of response?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. The last time I was in this room was about 4 years ago when we had a session here in November of 2009 on the constitutionality of the individual insurance mandate. Heritage put out a memorandum, a legal memorandum that I co-authored with Todd Gaziano, on the constitutionality of the individual insurance mandate, which was at the time something that no one was really much talking about. And as a result of this program that was held here and another program that was afterwards held upstairs with congressional staffers, we managed to persuade some Republicans that perhaps they should make a point of constitutional order against the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, which they had not previously been planning to do. So it was actually the event that took place in this room, as well as the event that took place after this room, that set us on the course to make a constitutional challenge against the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. So this is to me, it's kind of a homecoming to this room. Having said that, I have to say that I'm a little more uncomfortable being on this panel today than I was on that day. On that day, I was perfectly comfortable challenging Obamacare, which wasn't even passed yet, hadn't even come out of the Senate yet, as unconstitutional. Today, I'm on a panel on foreign policy, and it's not something that I typically write about, or even that I think as seriously about as either of the two gentlemen that I share the podium with. So one must ask the question, what am I doing here on this particular panel? So I think I can answer that question, and that is I am the libertarian for this particular panel. And I think the reason why I got sort of identified as somebody who should be invited to this panel probably dates back to an op-ed I had in the Wall Street Journal in 2008 during the Republican presidential campaign, where Ron Paul was one of the candidates then vying for the Republican presidential campaign nomination. And I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that, the Wall Street Journal, the newspapers always write your headlines for you. You don't write them yourself. But the sub-headline they picked for mine was "Ron Paul does not speak for me," that elicited a strong reaction from some of my libertarian friends, and actually some expressions of support from other of my libertarian friends for that column, and a debate ensued in the blogosphere between myself and some other folks about just what exactly does libertarianism have to say about war and foreign policy. And I think it was probably that stuff that got me included into this program. So let me just say a little bit about what I think about the relationship between libertarianism and foreign policy, and what I think is somewhat of a divide amongst libertarians on this issue. And before I do that, let me just skip to the chase and say that I agree with most of what's already been said about what's prudent and not prudent about American foreign policy. So there isn't going to be a major policy disagreement here, but I think the framing of this issue might be somewhat different. My framing of this issue might be somewhat different, although I don't think it's a whole heck of a lot different, for example, than Kim's framing of the issue already. So let me say, first of all, what I view libertarianism to be. I think libertarianism is a political philosophy, it's a political theory, and it's a political theory that claims that first and foremost comes the protection of individual rights. And by rights, we mean liberties. Rights can mean many things, but in this case, we mean individual rights, or what's called natural rights, and again, that's a matter of liberty. Libertarianism believes that by the protection of individual rights, not only is that good for individuals, but it's good for society as a whole. And where libertarians tend to, and I think this, by the way, to get back to Kim's point, is the core of classical liberal thought. Classical liberal thought placed at its core the idea of natural rights, the idea of individual liberty, first and foremost the rights of property and contract. Essentially, it's the Lockean view that everyone has the right to do whatever they will with what belongs to them, as opposed to the Hobbesian view that everybody has the right to do whatever they will, period, no matter what, and there you end up with a war of all against all. The classical liberal view, which is the core of the libertarian view, and that is that everybody has the right to do anything they want with what rightfully belongs to them. And then what separates libertarians from each other or what separates libertarians from other classical liberals, who be they conservative and sometimes be they progressives, is how far they're prepared to push those principles. How much do they think we can rely solely on individual rights and the protection of individual rights without the need for any other policies to supplement those? And at some point, different people get off the bus. They say, yes, individual rights are fine, but we also need this. Individual rights are fine, but we also need that. And what really distinguishes libertarians from others is that they basically think that the protection of individual rights is pretty much all we need. And if individual rights are properly defined and then they are properly protected, then on balance, not only will individuals do well, but society as a whole will also do well. And there's no real need to get off and compromise. Now, having said that, there still is an additional divide amongst libertarians who hold the view that pretty much all you need are individual rights. And that is the view as to whether you really need government to protect those individual rights or not. And as many of you know who are familiar with the history of American libertarianism, there are libertarians who believe in limited government as a means of protecting individual rights, and there are some libertarians who disagree and think that even there, government is not necessary to protect individual rights, that if we lived in a world without governments, there are other ways, alternate ways, that are not actually monopolistic institutions like governments that are capable of protecting individual rights effectively. But that's not the world in which we live. The world in which you live is a world in which there are governments and there are nation states. And so the question of U.S. foreign policy, or anybody's foreign policy, is of what to do in a world like that. And how should the and what is the appropriate role of the American government, if any, on the national stage. So in this regard, I think I would like to divide the issue into two issues, one which we've talked about and one which we haven't, although it was mentioned in the setup. And the first is the use of military force, or you might say the instrumentality of war, which is not, I think, to be confused, for example, with engagement or other policies or assistance or aid or all kinds of other things that we could think of American government doing short of engaging in war and using military force. So I think libertarians particularly focus on the use of war as a means and the use of military force as a means, as opposed to other kinds of engagement. And the second issue I'm going to put second, but I'll get to it second, is the issue of domestic policy, in particular domestic surveillance policy, which is something that's really on the front burner today and something that I actually have spoken out about in recent months, the NSA data collection program. So I think these are two distinguishable policies. They're obviously closely related to each other, but libertarians have something, I think, distinctive to say about each one of these. And the first thing I think the libertarians have to say is that war is different than other things, that the use of military force is different than other things. And it is a mistake for whoever it is, progressives or conservatives, whether it be LBJ or someone else, it's a mistake to sort of, well, view them all as kind of tools in a toolkit. And we pull the military tool off sometimes, and sometimes we pull off the aid tool, and we do what? No. These are not equivalent. The use of military force is different. The use of force is different. That's actually one of the things that libertarians bring to the table, the idea that you can pursue policies in a variety of different ways. But once you introduce the use of force into those policies, be it domestically to legislate morality or internationally to dictate morality, shall we say, by the use of military force, then something new and different and dangerous has been introduced into the equation that wasn't previously there when you pursued these policies in some other nonviolent, shall we say, way. So what this leads libertarians to conclude is that, in fact, they tend to favor what we would call a non-interventionist foreign policy, which was typically always called the non-interventionist foreign policy by its proponents and was only called isolationist by its opponents. That is, the only time you ever heard, it's like the Federalists they're the ones that dubbed the Anti-Federalists the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists never called themselves that. The Anti-Federalists called themselves true Federalists, and they thought those Federalists over there were nationalists. And it was like really they kind of were annoyed that the nationalists took the phrase Federalist to themselves and left the Anti-Federalists being antis, which they didn't really think of themselves as being. And libertarians don't think of themselves as being isolationists. They think of themselves as being non-interventionists. They actually think of themselves as being internationalists. There are people who think that national boundaries aren't quite as important in terms of human rights and individual liberty as others might think they are, that ethnic alignments and religious alignments aren't quite as important as other philosophies or other groups may think they are. But nevertheless, they favor non-interventionism, but non-interventionism with respect to the use of military force. Now, I think it's true, as Marion has suggested by his quote from Frank Meyer. Marion's use of Frank Meyer's quote suggests is that there was a time in the American political history when American libertarians allied themselves with the New Left anti-war movement during the 1960s, during the Vietnam War. This did happen, and it has deeply affected libertarian thinking ever since. I myself came along as a libertarian in the early 1970s. This had happened just before I became a libertarian, but I remember it, and I got involved in the organized libertarian movement at a time when it had already happened, and therefore I was able to experience what libertarianism was like after that had happened. And as a result of that happening, there was a certain amount of anti-war, and there still is a contingent of libertarians who are culturally anti-war or culturally what you might call pacifist. I think that's an honorable position. The pacifist position is an honorable position. Whether it's a prudent position at the end of the day, I'm not sure, but it's an honorable position to hold, as long as one is frank about it and not flying under color of being a non-interventionist, but actually being a pacifist. A non-interventionist is somebody who thinks that the use of American military power should not be used to intervene into the affairs of other countries unless the direct interest of the rights of the American people are at stake. In other words, unless the rights of the American people are being protected by the U.S. government. Let me use another analogy to describe the difference of what I'm talking about. A libertarian's belief in the protection of individual rights. What does that tell us exactly about how, for example, domestic criminal justice policy should be conducted? Well, my view is it doesn't tell us exactly how the American domestic criminal justice policy should be conducted. I used to be a criminal prosecutor. I can tell you there's lots of different ways you can run a prosecutor's office. There's lots of different ways you can run a police department. And it's not clear that libertarian first principles can tell you how to do those things. Libertarian first principles give you the end, that is the protection of individual rights, and it might actually tell you that certain types of laws should not be in existence, like, for example, drug laws, where individual rights are really not at stake, are not really being jeopardized, they're not really being violated. But it doesn't really tell you that much about the means. And I would say the same thing holds true with foreign policy. Libertarianism, in a sense, identifies what the end is, and the end is the protection of the individual rights of the American people, because that is the assumption that underlies the legitimacy of the U.S. government, that it's there in order, and as local governments are there to protect individual rights. But it doesn't exactly tell you what the means are. What exactly are the means by which you protect the individual rights of the American people? Here, I think, is where some libertarians believe that their first principles give them an answer to that. And the answer that gives them is something like pacifism, something like a consistent, across-the-board anti-war position, and something like the idea that war is a crime, which Marion has already criticized. I don't think that war is a crime follows from libertarian first principles. But I think the idea that war is the health of the state is something that libertarianism does teach, because it has in fact been our history, that war is the health of the state, which actually to some degree gives me a segue to the second part of the piece of this, which has to do with the domestic surveillance programs that we now currently are experiencing. If you don't think that war has tendency to be the health of the state, then you haven't been flying on airplanes much lately. Flying on airplanes used to be fun. It isn't fun anymore. It's not true that we have to undergo cavity searches before we fly in an airplane, but it actually has taken its toll on the liberties of the American people, and it's created a huge bureaucracy, the TSA, that didn't exist before. The state has thrived under conditions of war in a way that they hadn't before. So I would offer that as exhibit number one. And you could go back and find exhibit after exhibit of where the state has done pretty darn well and has flourished because they've had war as a justification. And why is that? Because it's a fundamental human desire for security. And the state tries to fill that desire. They promise to fill that desire for security by policies that actually grow its power at the expense of the liberties of the American people. So let me just talk a little bit about the NSA program, and then I'll close my remarks and we can head to a discussion. I think I'm somebody who was rather open to some of the surveillance issues in the wake of 9/11. I was also open, for example, to the Iraq War in ways some of my libertarian friends were not, as a means of self-defense. But I think what's happened in recent history, I'm not going to talk about Iraq, but certainly what's happened with respect to the National Security Agency as well as other domestic law enforcement agencies has vindicated the skepticism that that libertarians have about the relationship between war and the American people. And what we have developed is a system of empowerment of national security agencies with the ability to get information about all of us and any of us in ways that are really unprecedented. And one of the reasons why we had a successful constitutional challenge to the individual insurance mandate is because we were able to successfully argue that that was an unprecedented expansion of power to force you to buy an economic product, a commercial product that you didn't want to buy, so that it may regulate you under the Commerce Clause. That had never been done before. And something like what the NSA is doing right now has never been done before, in which the NSA claims the power to basically put a pen register, which means collect the data on all the phone calls that you make, to whom you make them, and how long you talk, without a search warrant and without any probable cause that you've been engaged in any sort of bad conduct. This is something, and they purport to have this power in secret without us knowing about it. And it's upheld in courts called FISA courts, which I believe are not actually real courts, because they are also secret courts in which not only are warrants approved in secret, which is typically the case with law enforcement, but the constitutionality of these programs is also approved in secret, which is not typically the case with the way our American judicial process works. And so for both of these reasons, we are in a different situation here that has been brought on by the existence of a war that we've been in, a war with Islamic fundamentalism. And so I would propose the following, as sort of, just as on the foreign policy side, libertarians favor non-interventionism, that is, no use of military force unless the rights of American people are directly affected, whether that be overseas or at home. I would offer 4 precepts, and actually they're not original to me, 4 precepts that I take from an essay by Nick Gillespie of Reason Magazine, in which I think this American domestic policy should be employed on the domestic front. And I do think this comes from a libertarian instinct, and I'll say what the 4 are and then I'll stop. The first is that you need transparency. Nick calls it transparency uber alles, but we need transparency. Why do you need transparency? You need transparency because we have, in principle, a Republican form of government. And in a Republican form of government, it is the people who are ultimately supposed to be the veto power over their agents in government. And there's no way that the people can serve this function of being the veto power over their agents in government if they don't know what their agents in government are doing. Now, that doesn't mean we have to know about specific investigations. We don't want to know about specific investigations, but we do want to know about general programs and their existence. And it's not enough for individual panels of Congress to know about these things and the American people not know about them, because we cannot hold Congress accountable unless we know about them. So number 1 is transparency. Whether you like it or not, the American people need to be told exactly what these programs are and what they are not. Even if this does have the effect of empowering the enemy, it still is necessary for us to know. 2, legal authority is not an option. Is not optional, sorry. Legal authority is not optional. You must have legal authority. You can't just make it up as you go along. There has to be authorization for this sort of thing to be done. And what's happened with respect to the domestic surveillance project is I believe it's gone way beyond the authorization of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which authorized some administrative subpoenas to be used to collect data. I believe what's actually going on here goes way beyond the actual authorization that was done under the original statute. 3rd, target the bad guys. Don't target us. And I use the TSA as a good example, where every American has to pay a price every time that there is a successful or unsuccessful terrorist attempt. All of our liberties get infringed upon. Target the bad guys, don't target us. And finally, track the effectiveness of what you're doing. I mean, what is the effectiveness of the security theater that we have to undergo when we go to the airport? It never has to really be justified. I don't believe it actually is justified. And this is just the most visible of many programs. We hear in defense of, for example, the national NSA's data collection program that it has prevented this, that, or the other kind of incident. But in fact, we don't really know that that's the case. And when we've seen examples given, it turns out that with each one of those examples, ordinary law enforcement techniques were actually used to discover those particular plots. Not the kind of needle in the haystack approach that the NSA claims to be following. The one last thing I'll say about the needle in the haystack approach is that the theory of this data collection program is that we need to collect massive data to be analyzed to find the needle of the haystack. This is the only program in history where the way you find a needle in the haystack is to make the haystack as big as possible. So the more information we gather, that was supposedly the better we're going to be at identifying these things. This has yet to be proven. It's a theory, but it has yet to be proven, and I don't think that the benefit of the doubt should go to the government when the power it gets by virtue of all of the information it has over us is just too dangerous. I think I've said it, so that's the last thing I was going to say, but I'll say one more thing, and this is for those of my friends on the right. If you think about why it is that we libertarians and conservatives have long opposed gun registration as opposed to gun control, We oppose gun registration because it's putting the information of where all the guns are in the hands of the government is going to make it easier in the future to violate our rights. And so it's the information that in the possession of government that we find to be so dangerous. The same thing is true with everything else we do. And in fact, you wouldn't even need gun registration if this data collection program works as advertised. They're going to be able to figure out who has the guns just from your email traffic and your telephone traffic. So with that, having said a lot more than I thought I was going to be able to say, I will now stop.
I'm very glad we didn't invite a scholar who claims up front to be a foreign policy expert. That would have lengthened the discussion substantially, I think. I'm going to ask members of the audience if they'd like to contribute questions. I would ask that before you ask a question, you wait for the microphone, which will come around to you. I'd also like to ask that you state your name and your institution affiliation, if any. The event is, of course, being recorded, and we'd like to have your questions as well as answers audible for future watchers of the program. I'm going to take the usual moderator's privilege of asking the introductory question and ask all panelists, if they'd like to consider the relationship of culture to foreign policy in a couple of ways. For Professor Barnett, something that has always maybe not troubled me, but made me curious about a libertarian view of foreign policy is that there tends, as you noted, to be an emphasis on the dangers of military intervention, which is perfectly fair enough. I understand where that emphasis comes from. But there are many forms of American intervention abroad which are entirely unofficial. There's the flow of American culture abroad. There's the travel and work of American missionaries. There's the enormous importance of trade. Some of these things benefit from government protection in the loosest sense of the term, but I think they're genuinely unofficial. But there's no denying they're going to have an enormous effect on the cultures of places living abroad in ways that may end up redounding on the official need of the American state to reply. They may create a defense necessity for the American state. And I've always been curious about how you sort of separate military intervention from private American intervention in the world without then thinking that private intervention and sometimes is going to produce a need for an official American response, or at least the perceived need. For all panelists, is it possible to separate American culture from the conduct of American foreign policy? We heard quite a little bit about the importance of the American military, the importance of the American economy, but not a whole lot was said about the importance of American culture, which in my view has to underlie the conduct of American foreign policy and American government as a whole. Is it possible for us to maintain a consistent foreign policy in an era when sort of the predominant culture is increasingly in flux? Anyway.
Well, let me take the stab at this question of culture. You actually asked two different questions about it. Here's how I see it. When I talked about the different kinds of power, competitive power, or influence in the world, and I mentioned culture along with economy and technology, what I had in mind was, I was thinking of it almost strategic analysis. In other words, do we really understand the world? Do we really understand where our culture fits in the world and others fit in the world? And an example that comes to mind, Walter's here, who's director of our Asian Studies Center, is that do we Americans really understand what the Chinese are up to, for example? We sometimes have this capacity of doing mirror imaging of our own culture and our own views of the world onto other people's, and that's not only true with respect to the Chinese, also with respect to a large part of the Middle East. We mirror image our own values and our own expectations of the world, when in fact their view of us and the world is quite different. The Chinese probably, as Walter and I discussed in the past, see America as an interloper in Asia. And we're the revisionist power. For the 5,000 years they've been the Middle Kingdom, and yet we tend to see them as the rising power, and we don't understand how culture affects their expectations of the world. That's what I meant when I mentioned culture. Now, on the American side, there's different kinds of cultures. There's our political culture, our value systems, a belief in democracy, constitutional government, all of the the political side of it, but there's also popular culture, which I discuss in my book how there's a big difference between American popular culture and its influence in the world than it was in the 50s and the 60s. When I went back and did some research, I'm not being nostalgic about the 50s and the 60s, but back in those days, American power and its political culture and its popular culture were pretty much in sync. And it was considered to be a formidable force in the world. The American way of life, sometimes it was called. And it was very powerful. That's not the case today. Our popular culture, particularly in places like the Middle East, is seen as a subversive force. And sometimes it gets mixed in with our political values, and we wonder why our belief in freedom and democracy gets associated with Lady Gaga or something strange like that, because they see it as part of a continuum, if you will, of American culture. And so this is also a dimension that we probably don't talk about enough, about what is it the rest of the world really sees as American culture. It's not just all about liberty and democracy, it's also about our popular culture.
Well, maybe I can answer that by sort of giving a historical perspective. So the American founders and early statesmen talked about national character. And this was exhibited in many ways, first and foremost, commerce. So Alexander Hamilton and others talked about the American enterprising spirit. Thomas Jefferson recognized this, even though he was an agrarian. He recognized that without trade, an awful lot of produce would be rotting in barns. So he understood that trade was our national path to prosperity. At the time, that was contrasted with the empires, which mercantilism and colonization was the path to prosperity. And so it was American missionaries, American tradesmen overseas that often were the unofficial diplomats or whatever else of American culture. Now, what role did the military play in this? It played a very important role. The first few wars that we fought were fought to protect trade. And at each one of those spots on the globe, be it the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, within the first 20 years, we had the choice as a country, when attacked, when we're engaged in peaceful commerce, we could either withdraw that trade, and that would have an impact, of course, on our prosperity over time, or we could go and defend our right to trade freely. And if we went and we defended our right to trade freely, which we did. Under John Adams, we did it against the French in the Caribbean. Under Thomas Jefferson, we did it in the Mediterranean against the Barbary States. When we did that, it meant that our idea of trade, of international law, the law of nations at the time is what it was called, it won. And American citizens were more free then to trade overseas. We did the same thing very early on throughout the 1800s with missionaries who were in the Middle East or elsewhere. If they were treated unfairly, we would go and make a diplomatic presence, and we would sort of rattle our sabers if they were being attacked and killed without any law and justice for them in that country. So what did all this mean? I mean, you may not like this story, but this was the national character. This is the role that the American founders and statesmen thought the military should play, and this is what created the foundations for a country that was willing and able to take up the role of international leadership following World War II. It wasn't an accident that we were the country that took that role. And I'll just, to back all this up, we'll quote George Washington when addressing Congress in 1793. He wrote that he spoke that there is a rank due to the United States among nations which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to secure peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. So if we continue to cut our military, we continue to make it known that we won't defend Americans, our American citizens, be they aid workers or missionaries or business people overseas, they're going to be less safe over time if we continue along this path. And in terms of trade, I mean, we still are a commercial republic. That has direct ramifications for how Americans live at home, what's happening in terms of our commerce overseas. So what will we do if a U.S. trading ship is attacked in the Straits of Hormuz if there's an attack on the Suez Canal and it disrupts our trade, what will we do? A strict non-interventionist, and I've had this debate with many good friends, but a strict non-interventionist tells you, well, there's something about the fact that you shouldn't be there to begin with, and that's wrong. You can advocate for a strict non-interventionist sort of grand strategy, and that's fine, and maybe that's what we'll want going forward in the 21st century. But it's not a traditional American grand strategy, and it's not the one that got us to where we are.
I'm not sure what I can say that's too succinct about the issue of culture. It's like a huge topic, but let me just offer the following. I think a libertarian would generally believes that culture is a product of spontaneous ordering rather than imposed ordering, and it results. And a good culture is a product of recognizing the rights of a free people. But we don't identify politics, which is the recognition and protection of those rights, with culture itself. So therefore, we believe in some sense we have political selves in which we advocate for our individual liberties, and then we have cultural selves in which we advocate for moral conduct against immoral conduct and for right and against wrong. I think it's just a complete myth to think that libertarians are indifferent to morality or that we're somehow libertines. That's just not the case. We're people who think that morality is really, in some sense, so important that it can't be trusted to the state. And that the intermediate institutions, which are sometimes called the intermediate institutions like schools and churches and other institutions, are part of this spontaneous ordering mechanism by which the culture emerges. Now, I think as a result, I do believe that what makes America exceptional isn't something about our genes. It is something about our culture, but that culture is the culture that gives primacy to the individual and the rights of the individual. And when that happens, all kinds of good things happen, and then those things get visible to other people. And is it a subversive force to the forces of despotism or even the forces of monarchy? It has always been a subversive force. The example of America has always been a subversive force. And then the question is, what are the powers that are being subverted do about it? And they've had a variety of ways of trying to strike back, including, in this case, flying planes into the Twin Towers is one way they tried to strike back. But I just don't think this is the sort of thing that can be made the subject of American government. The culture can be made the subject of American governmental policy. I think where we just saw that happen is when a maker of a film that was critical of Islam got locked up by the American government. First of all, blamed for something that happened domestically as a provocation, which turns out to be completely false. And then secondly, locked up under a pretext because he made a film. And so there's an example of how one American government, the current American government, reacted to somebody who was sort of privately engaging in a cultural discourse. And I think it's not the role of the American government to do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the audience if they'd like to contribute. Yes, the gentleman right there. Yeah.
Pre-Iraq, I had a pretty concrete view of what our foreign policy should be, and particularly our military, use of the military. I guess pre-Iraq and Afghanistan. And that view has been shaken dramatically.
From what to what?
I was supportive of the Iraq War. I thought it made sense. I thought that the idea of spreading democracy in the Middle East was a great foreign policy strategy and would make us safer. And I'm certainly not foolish enough to still believe that. I'm here really because I'm trying to figure out where I am on foreign policy, and a lot of what you gentlemen have said has been appealing to me. And I want to specifically mention what Mr. Barnett said, but I also want to direct the question to all three of you. Are our rights directly threatened by Iran having a nuclear bomb? And therefore, what is your 4 points suggest we should do about it? Either nothing or what? And the other gentleman I would ask, what do you think we should do about this? I start with the premise that, based upon the experience of the Bush administration and the Europeans and the Obama administration, that negotiations and sanctions are not going to be effective. So should we accept it or should we not? And what should we do about it?
All right. Can I start?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, all right. Well, a disclaimer, I'm a conservative, I'm not a libertarian, so what I'm about ready to say may not be that much of a surprise. I think we can learn from one another, but I do start from there. And so let me talk about Iraq first and then end on Iran. I was in the State Department during the beginning of the Iraq War. I was Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. So we were negotiating the whole issue in the UN Security Council and the run-up to the war. And I just want to make 2 points about that. The run-up to the war and the whole issue in the war about the inspections and Saddam Hussein's nuclear program and his weapons of mass destruction program, that was the driving issue. So it was a national security discussion. It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about spreading freedom. That's not what we talked about at the Security Council. That's not what everyone understood the issue to be about. Now, you can argue whether or not we should have done it, but it was understood as a national security issue. Later, after the occupation began and U.S. and coalition forces were inside Iraq, there needed to be some kind of a way to create a new legitimate government. And you basically had 2 choices on how to do that. One is you let the United Nations go in and take care of it for you. Well, they didn't want to do that. They got out very quickly because they thought it was too insecure and they didn't like their war to begin with. So the UN option of legitimation was not there. The other one was to hold elections. So the people of Iraq could elect their government. And that was the approach that was taken. It was then, particularly in the second inaugural, that President Bush talked about the freedom agenda. But it was going back and actually putting on a larger context on the whole thing that wasn't really there in the lead up to the war. Now, there may have been other people involved who had other views about what was really going on there, why we did it, and the like, and they may say all kinds of things. All I can tell you that on the functional policy level, it was mainly about national security. On Iran, what difference can it possibly make? I mean, if you assume that, as I do, that the United States is still has global interests, and that those interests imply the forward presence not only of American interests but also even of our military forces to maintain certain stability. I talked about a global stability, a balance of power. So that means you cannot be entirely disinterested in what happens in the Middle East, in my view of the world. It's not just about Israel. It's not just about the oil. It's about the entire region. And so if Iran developing a nuclear weapon capability becomes a potential hegemonic power in that region, it won't be just Israel that's upset. It'll be the Shiites and the Saudis, and the Sunnis and the Saudis and others that will be threatened by it, and it increases not only the possibility of war in that region, but it also creates the possibility of if they have this capability, that therefore the ability of the United States to intervene in any place with even conventional power in the Middle East is taken off the table, because it would deter us from doing that, particularly if the capability was aimed not only at Israel but at our European allies, and particularly if they get a long-range ballistic missile, it's aimed at us. So it's like a strategic chess game. And it's very complex about how far they're along the road to do it. But what I'm saying is that it's not something that we can tolerate. What do we do about it? If Israel, in my view, believes that they must do something about it with military force, we should not stand in their way and criticize them. Whether or not we do something directly about it at some point is a matter that would have to be looked at under the circumstances. And the main thing I would say about it is you would not take military force off the table. Don't exclude it ahead of time. Doesn't mean you do it. That was our policy for a long time. It's certainly not our policy now. Now we're basically signaling to them that it will not be used, and they're moving as quickly as possible to get this capability. I just think that's unwise. I just don't think it's a good thing for us, for our friends in the Middle East, or for the stability of the world for Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
I just want to say I feel your pain. I've actually been where you are and am, in some respects, where you are now. I just kind of want to validate that. And it doesn't mean, I mean, you're looking for answers. I'm kind of looking for answers. I'm not up here as a guy who purports to know exactly what is to be done about all these things. But I think I might draw a slightly, as somebody who did also support in my head, I mean, I didn't do anything overt except write an op-ed, but I mean, in my head, I sort of supported this, both the Afghan and the Iraq war initiative, but I supported them as acts of self-defense. And I mean, a good offense is the best defense is a good offense. So you take the war to your enemy. You don't wait till your enemy comes to you. And I think both of these did, in different ways, do that. Afghanistan, obviously, more directly, but even Iraq as well. I think I said Iran, but I mean Iraq. Iraq as well. And so I kind of was where you are. However, I think that one of the problems here is that we put the administration that was responsible for this was a big government conservative administration, the very same administration that has given us No Child Left Behind and a number of other big government domestic programs gave us another big government foreign program. And I think one of the lessons from Iraq is not that that particular invasion was necessarily counterproductive. It has turned out possibly to be, but it might have actually been a good thing to have an American foreign presence there or military association there in order to engage in other kinds of war activity against Islamic fascism. But the problem was the nation-building project that it turned into, which is what Kim is referring to, in which you ended up staying for a very long time. And Americans, just have never had a taste for that, for good reason. And we didn't even have a taste for that when it came to reconstructing the South. They were only prepared to keep Northern troops in the South for a particular period of time, and after it got too difficult, they said, pull the troops out, even there, where we had a very good reason for fighting, and we had just fought a war for very good reason. And so, in that respect, I think the lesson here is whatever is to be done about Iran has to be in and out. It has to be able to be accomplished in that way, or it isn't going to be accomplished. So you either have an objective you can accomplish that way, militarily, or you don't do anything. You don't do it at all. But you don't do anything that requires a Rube Goldberg type, long-range, everything's got to fall into place, and we've got to do a big social planning thing in order to make it work strategy. That's a strategy that's doomed to failure, and the American people won't support it.
Just on the question of Reconstruction, as a Southerner, I think the Union troops left not soon enough. But on Iran, I mean, by Iran's actions and words, they've proven they're an enemy of the United States. And so I don't know what else you have to go by about what a state actor is going to do. And if they're your enemy, why would you want them to have greater capacity to do you harm? In terms of your disillusionment, many people are very dissatisfied with the main narratives of U.S. foreign policy. And we're in a state, especially I think among my generation, most of what we talk about, most of what's in the public discourse in terms of foreign policy, most of the foreign policy spokesperson and spokespeople in either party are offer very unattractive and pretty unsustainable ideas about America's role in the world going forward. And I would just say that this is partly because the sort of older traditional American national interest perspective that the founders and early statesmen represented was supplanted by the progressive notion, the Wilsonian idea of making the world safe for democracy. And then sort of in reaction to that, you had a camp of realists who came and introduced a much more, I won't say amoral, but certainly a more sort of amoral approach to foreign policy than the founders would have been comfortable with, certainly. So in a way, our foreign policy debate is much more influenced by progressives and European-style realists than it is by our American founders and early statesmen. And so I think we, as Americans, and what our foreign policy should be doing in this century, should be looking back at our strategic culture. And I think a very good place to start is in the founding era with John Quincy Adams, architect of the Monroe Doctrine. These people were thinking very seriously about how a small commercial republic could influence international affairs, the international order. And they were so confident in their ideas that the Monroe Doctrine said to an international imperialist system, we're going to claim 1/3 of the world's surface. And different rules here. Different rules apply. That's hardly an isolationist policy or doctrine.
I think think we have time for just one more question. So, the lady right here on the second row in the back.
Thank you very much. Most interesting, especially the young person's viewpoint. But, well, the young people's viewpoint is a little more difficult for me to grasp because most young people are idealists, and some of us who are a little wiser and older are more realistic. But let's leave that because my question is really, you had mentioned the democratic election in Iraq being almost like a byproduct of prior circumstances. How do we at this point justify our democratic desire for democracy in Egypt and Libya when we are dealing with a different mentality? We cannot, as Americans, and I appreciate it more than probably most people here. I grew up under totalitarianism, communism, so for me the American exceptionalism is unique, a treasure, and a great thing that I want to protect. So, but when we go into the Middle East, which lives with a different mentality, a whole different, not a Western civilization, but still tribalism to a great extent, because there's lack of education and a lot of illiteracy, how do we expect to impose our way of democracy on them without some of a transitional period? To go in and have a democratic election, it's very easily manipulated. It just goes to show what happened in Egypt.
Yeah, and even in Iraq for that matter. The point I was trying to make about the elections in Iraq is it was mainly a practical decision about how you get a legitimate government. It wasn't the motivating decision. It was mainly about national security. But once you're there, you have to have something. And as we saw in the case of Iraq, we've seen Egypt. Elections alone are not what democracy really is all about. Democracy, I actually don't like in the American context, Marion can talk about this, is that we're a republic here. And I may believe that the value of liberty and supporting individual rights, natural rights, is the universal American idea. Notice I didn't mention democracy. I mean, democracy is, in the French Revolutionary tradition, can end up in the guillotine. It can end up in the tradition of Bolshevism or even popular dictatorship. And that's not the way the founders looked at popular sovereignty through constitutional government. So even in the American experience, I don't see a need to promoting democracy as an ideology, not just for the practical reasons that you're raising, is because it may not take root. And besides democracy are more than elections. And we saw with in Hamas in Gaza what happened. Sometimes a majority of people will vote a dictator into power. We saw this with the rise of Adolf Hitler. We've seen it in other instances as well. That's why our founders believed in a constitutional republic that actually put limits on popular sovereignty in the sense that it should not be abused. Madison was very much a realist. He didn't believe in referenda, just letting go out and ask the American people at any given day what they want to do on this tax or in this policy. They would elect their representatives, they would deliberate, and then they would, within the framework of the Constitution, make decisions. That's our tradition. Promoting democracy and elections abroad is not our tradition, although, unfortunately, that's what it's gotten reduced to in the popular mind, and frankly, not only in both parties, at least in certain parts of both parties. And I just think it's a mistake.
I'm smiling because I agree with every word that Kim just said. And I thought I was going to have to say all of that or something, or my version of all of that. And we've never met before, I don't think, Kim. But I mean, but I really agree with that. I mean, it's the left that has transmuted what makes America special from liberty to democracy. We were a Republican. I've mentioned Republican form of government, which means ultimately the people have to be the check on the government. But the people are not the government, and the government is not us. In the identification of the people with the government is a left-wing idea, which is easily translated into democracy and democratic rule or majoritarian rule, however you wish to put it. And that's not really our tradition. The American founding fathers were against democracy. Democracy was a pejorative. Democracy was a pejorative like demagogue is today. And it was something that they were against because they'd experienced some version of it in the States, and they wanted a different kind of government for the national government than that. So I agree with that. And what I remember is during the '89, when there was the fall of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of demonstrators in the street in Eastern Europe protesting for liberty, and the American press that covered that kept retranslating all of their protests into saying they're actually a democracy movement. They were not a democracy movement. They were a liberty movement. And when they said liberty, the American press reported to the American public that what they were wanting was democracy, and it was a mistranslation of most of what they were saying. So mostly I just want to agree with everything that Kim just said about that.
Strike one.
What country are you from? Hungary, yeah. So, I mean, you look at that period where you were essentially a captive nation in a way, and you see that America played a very important role in all of that. And you would probably think that Reagan played a fairly important role, at least in what America could do. We didn't do everything, but what we could do to sort of tip the balance of power in favor of liberty and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We contributed to that in some sense, not least by the arms race. And we were doing that because we were committed to our national interests and to protecting our sovereignty and sort of hard, non-fuzzy things.
And we had a true leader.
And we did have a true leader. And so I think Dr. Holmes also mentioned that it's sort of a byproduct, all of these positive things that happen when the United States is trying to secure its national interest. What George Washington called our interests guided by justice. Our understanding of our interest is different than was, Great Britain in the 18th century or Germany in the early 20th century. And so this has real ramifications when we win. And this is why we want to win wars. Ronald Reagan said that of the 4 wars fought in his lifetime, none of them were fought because the United States was too weak. So sort of the fundamental ideas that I was talking about earlier, what's the practical ramification of this in our policy? If war is sort of criminal and war is the health of the state, not to frame it that a sovereign state must protect itself by military force, which sometimes means fighting wars, but to say war is the health of the state and this sort of highly critical view. Well, what does it mean? If war is a crime, then preparing for war must be somehow suspect, right? Somehow criminally suspect. And so we are seeing an all-time high in the idea that our defense is just too big.
Can I just add something to that real quickly? It really matters what the purposes of war are. We use the word war, actually I don't use it that often, because it implies a sort of moral equivalence between the two sides that are fighting. It's not making a distinction of who attacked whom and what are they fighting for. All that gets lost in this big word called war. I sometimes have discussions with my friends in Europe, and particularly those who are from Germany. And they, you probably know some Germans, they had this position that given what happened in World War II, that there is something inherently immoral about war, given their own history, the way they used it. And they sometimes, and this has happened to me when I was at the State Department, I get visited by officials from Germany. They would start lecturing me as an American about America's traditional position here and the constitutional this. And really you need to, during the Iraq War, I was lectured quite often about supposedly what America should and should not be doing with respect to warfare. And I would very politely wait for them to finish. And I said, just remember one thing. What you're calling war ended up defeating your country, Germany, Nazi Germany. But for us, it was a cause of victory. So you lost, we won. And we therefore look at it a little bit differently than you do. And not only do we look at it differently because it was a different outcome, because the cause was entirely different. It was a genocidal dictatorship, killing millions of people and starting a world war. And to accuse the very means that we used to defeat that power with the very power that they were trying to impose on others in a sense of kind of a moral equivalence is not only sophistry, it's just a moral outrage. But it is done quite often.
I would agree with that, but I would also respond to Marion and say that war is not necessarily a crime, or it's not a crime in the sense that Kim has just said. But war could still be the health of the state. I mean, those two propositions are separated from each other. And because war could be the health of the state, in fact, I think war is the health of the state, you have to be very circumspect about when you use it, because there are serious costs that come with using this means, even when it's justified to use it. And it's not just something you can use as a matter of policy, along with all the other tools in the toolkit, in your policy toolkit, because it does have this tendency to be the health of the state. So I just would, you run these two propositions together, and I would keep them separate and say one could be true and the other could be false. And the one that's true should basically caution us about when we would use war as a means.
I don't disagree with that at all. But as a practical matter, just the sort of way these ideas are playing out is that they are conflated very often. So it's no accident that the very popular non-interventionist and anti-war website, antiwar.com, is funded and supported by the Randolph Bourne Institute. And so here you have the convergence of a sort of leftist libertarianism and an anti-statist, anti-war progressivism that is heavily influencing especially my generation in terms of thinking about these questions. I haven't, disagreed with anything you said on foreign policy, but I think there is a historical memory that my generation doesn't share with the two of you. And so, as I said at the beginning,
And if we don't mind, what is that exactly?
We didn't grow up in a communist era. We didn't view any sort of threat as being existential.
Yeah.
We're very naive in terms of the actual experience that it's an accident of history almost, except that it's not. We fought wars. We defended our territory. We steadily extended respect for these ideas that allow us to go all around the world almost and travel. And this is the ideas have consequences. The idea of peace through strength has consequences, and not just for wars. I'm not a warmonger. War is terrible. War is horrible. But so is the idea that nothing's worth war. That's even worse.
Yeah, I think the historical experiences of our generations are important. As I was mentioning the Cold War, and he was nodding. When I was a very young boy, I remember cowering in my bathroom during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in Florida, and we were fully expecting to have a nuclear war the next day.
We all thought.
I thought it was coming.
When you're a little kid, you're raised up imagining that it all could be vaporized tomorrow. I mean, as a little child, you're just raised with the idea that everything could just be gone tomorrow, and you have to think about what that would mean. Well, you have to confront that at the age of 8, 9, 10, 7, 6, whatever it is, because you've got drills and you see things happening. It does change your approach to things compared to people who've never had to grow up under that threat.
And that's not shared by my generation. I think that there's a positive side of that, meaning in some sense we've won, at least for now. But Rachel Maddow, who I almost never agree with, has highlighted how this is unhelpful for our thinking about foreign policy, because there's a real disconnect between the people who actually fight wars, meaning they have a realistic understanding of what all this means, and the rest of the country, which goes on virtually undisturbed in any way, even though two wars were raging. And I think there is some insight there that is useful in how we think about foreign policy, in that we're insulated from sane thinking.
Well, on that note of mostly agreement, it's always nice to end on maybe a solid 85%, maybe even 90% convergence. I'd like to thank the panelists for an interesting discussion, and thank the audience for struggling here in such good numbers on such a foul day. And my hope on behalf of all of you that it stopped raining out there. Thank you very much.